Ruth chapter 3. The story of Ruth and Boaz is more than just a story about two people who end up getting married. It is a beautiful story of people showing love towards the people around them, and even showing love towards people who had already passed away. I want you to think about that for a moment. Ruth and Orpah were the two sisters, and Naomi, the mother-in-law, commented about how kind they had been to their husbands. Don't forget that, because that will have a significance later on in this passage. Here, buddy. You got tangled up. There you go. All right. This will have some significance later on in the passage. It's a wonderful example of people showing love towards God, and Naomi had both these daughters-in-law and showing love towards their husbands. But Ruth is the one who had shown love towards God. She had shown dedication to the true God and to the ways of the true God. And in this chapter, we're going to find out a lot about the ways of the true God. Orpah, on the other hand, went back to serving the false gods. So there is a big contrast there. But in today's lesson, we're going to find out how truly dedicated Ruth was to doing what is right and to learning God's ways and to applying the ways of God. I want us to understand very clearly, we are saved by grace, not by works. By grace ye are saved through faith, not of yourselves as the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. That's Ephesians 2:8-9. But then verse 10 talks about, but we are created to do good works. So we're not saved by our works, but we are expected to do what's right. And what's so wonderful is we see both Ruth and Boaz being so committed to doing what's right in this passage. The God who would eventually send his only begotten Son because he loved this world is who is being served and worshipped. And I want us to remember that. The two greatest commands are to love God and to love others. And knowing God's love for us should motivate us to obey those two commands. But we will also see that Boaz was very committed to God. May both Ruth and Boaz encourage us to live our lives doing things God's way, whether it seems to benefit us or not. As we mentioned in the illustration earlier, what Jesus Christ did on the cross didn't seem to benefit him much. He went through terrible agony on that cross. He died. But he did it because it benefited others. That's what loving your neighbor as yourself is about. Let's bow for a word of prayer, and then we'll dig into this passage. Dear Lord, I pray that you guide us. As we look at your word this morning, I pray that we would be faithful to you, that we would understand you and your word better. I pray that we would hunger to share your word with others. And I pray that we would hunger to live our lives in a way that shows your love to others and shows our love to you. In Jesus' name, amen. So just to catch up on what's been happening here, Ruth has been working hard through the harvest. But now the harvest is over. And Naomi would like to have some rest for Ruth. Some rest and some security. And if you look at verse 1 of chapter 3, some of your versions will have her, it'll talk about her seeking security. Some of your versions will have her seeking rest. Depending on which version you have, it'll use a different word there. And that's okay. You might say, well, why did they choose different words? It's because there might not be an exact equivalent English word for that Hebrew word. And that Hebrew word has the idea of both security and rest. Because when you're feeling safe, you can rest. Imagine you're out camping in the wilderness and you know there's a bear lurking in that area. How much sleep are you going to get? You're not going to get a lot of rest because you don't feel secure. Now, when I go to bed at night, I hit the pillow and I'm out. I feel pretty safe. I'm not worried. But if I hear the thunder banging and the wind blowing, all of a sudden I don't feel so secure and I don't sleep so well. So the idea of security and rest do tie together. You understand why both those words might be used for that broader Hebrew word that has a little bit fuller meaning. So don't let that worry you that they chose two different words, because both those words have the idea of what Naomi wants Ruth to be able to find. So we come to verse 1 of chapter 3. It says that then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that I may be well with you? Or may I seek rest for you, that it may be well with you?" Naomi understood that if Ruth were to marry a godly man with some financial security, then Ruth could have her needs taken care of. She could feel safe. She could rest. She would have a husband to provide for her. So Naomi shares her plan. Naomi works as the matchmaker, essentially. Verses 2 through 4. And now is Boaz your kinsman? And now is not Boaz our kinsman, with whose maids you were? Behold, he winnows barley at the threshing floor tonight. Wash yourself, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. And do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. And it shall be when he lies down, that you shall notice the place where he lies. And you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will tell you what you shall do. Essentially, Naomi wants Ruth to approach Boaz to see if he's willing to marry her. We've been talking about this idea of raising up seed, and how if Ruth has a child with a near kinsman of her deceased husband, how that child will get a portion of the inheritance. And how Boaz is one of the near kinsmen, and how this could reduce the amount of inheritance that Boaz will end up getting. Because remember, the inheritance returns to the family every 50 years. Now, we don't know how close it is to the end of that 50 years. It's called the year of Jubilee. But it isn't like when we sell a piece of property today. If I were to sell a chunk of land to Mick, he'd buy the land, it would be his until he sold it to somebody else. But in the Jewish culture at that time, the Hebrew culture at that time, and in the Hebrew law of God at that time, if I were to sell that land to Mick, and let's just say the year of Jubilee was 2030, what would happen at 2030 is that land would come back to my family. And if I were deceased, it would be divided between my children. So at that time, Mick would have to give it back. So essentially what he would be buying is the right to use my land for 6 years. Actually, 5.5 at this point. But that gives you a picture of what's going on here. So if Ruth has a child from a near kinsman, that child will get part of that inheritance. That means Boaz will get less, and so will the other relatives. Because the land is divided up every 50 years at the year of Jubilee, or every 49 years at the year of Jubilee. Naomi wants Ruth to approach Boaz to see if he will marry her. Now, I've heard some speculation about this whole thing about uncovering his feet. What's going on when his feet are uncovered? In fact, I've even heard some risque explanations for what Ruth might have been doing there. She was acting very proper, and I want you to understand why she would uncover his feet. And it is actually found within the Hebrew law. In fact, the Hebrew law that explains exactly what I was just talking about that land transfer, and about raising up seed. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 9. And I want you to listen closely to this, because this is showing what Boaz and Ruth wanted to obey. This passage is very key to understanding the whole book of Ruth. And it's key to understanding why his feet would be uncovered. So Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 9. Says, when brothers live together and one of them dies and has no son. Let me just pause there. That's what happened with Ruth's husband. Ruth's husband died, did not have a son. By the way, Ruth's father-in-law, Naomi's husband, had also died, and both his sons had died, so he no longer has sons either. So there's a lot of property that ends up getting divided up here. It's not just the shares for the son, it's a share that would have went to Elimelech's son, Naomi's husband's son, that is at stake here. It says, again, in Deuteronomy 25, verse 5, it says, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a strange man. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her to himself as wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. Now understand, there were no other sons of Naomi to marry Ruth. So that husband's brother is not available to be marrying her. So that term brother is kind of like that term for rest or security. There is a little bit broader meaning to that. The primary meaning is the closest brother, the literal son of your mother, the son of your father, or the son of your father and another mother would be the next closest brother. And then the next closest would be the son of your uncle. The whole point is the brother means a near kinsman. And the closer the brother, the more closer it is to the meaning. So the closest kinsman is the one they want to be marrying them, if possible. And if he's not available, then the next closest kinsman. You're going to see this in the book of Ruth. But that word brother can have a broader meaning than just the son of your mother. Verse 6 of Deuteronomy 25. And it shall be that the firstborn who she bears shall assume the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out from Israel. That's what I was talking about. He's going to assume the name of the dead brother. So the son that Naomi has is going to assume the name not of Naomi's new husband, but the name of Naomi's old husband. And he'll get the inheritance of her own husband, so that the name not be blotted out of Israel. Verse 7. But if the man does not desire to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to establish a name for his brother in Israel. He is not willing to perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of this city shall summon him and speak to him. And if he persists and says, I do not desire to take her, then his brother's wife shall come to him in the sight of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face, and she shall declare, thus it is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. Look at verse 4 of Ruth 3. I want you to think of that in the context of Deuteronomy 25, saying, if the man is not willing to marry his brother's widow, and if the elders can't convince him that he should do that, she has the right to pull off his sandal and spit in his face, to say, you're not honoring your brother's name, to raise up a name for him. She gets to take a sandal off his foot. So why would Ruth reveal Boaz's foot? To point to his sandal and say, do I get to take off your sandal? I want you to read verse 4 of Ruth 3 with that in mind. And it shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go and uncover his feet and lie down. Then he will tell you what you shall do. So she's going to uncover that foot, and he's going to say, either he's going to say, yes, I'll be the kinsman, or he'll say, hey, you can take my sandal out and spit in my face because I'm not willing to do it. That's what she's going to have to deal with. He's going to have to tell her what to do. He's going to have to tell her how to follow what God has commanded here. But here's what's interesting. Last week we talked a little bit about how, in fact, I think it might have been a couple weeks ago, how Boaz was setting a good example at talking to his servants about the Lord. And then he set a good example of living out love, and how that ought to be an example for us. How we ought to say things about God in front of other people and live it out. So we ought to both live our lives as Christians to set an example and speak about Christ so people can hear the gospel. And you think of Ruth coming from a foreign land and maybe not knowing as much about the true God as what the people who had grown up around Bethlehem had. And how that was such a wonderful opportunity for Boaz and these servants to be talking about God while they're out in this threshing area, out in this field, out in this farm field, they're talking about God. And then they're living out the love of God, and Ruth is able to see how living a life for God is supposed to look. Now she is also hearing it from Naomi, and she's hearing about these Old Testament principles. And then Naomi is saying, talk to Boaz, or listen to Boaz, listen to Boaz, and let him talk to you about what you're supposed to do. We've been talking a lot about discipleship the last time. Part of discipleship is trusting somebody else to pick up where you left off. Tyler, I talked to you at the gas station the other day. You told me you were working for Nick now. I says, when you're working with Nick, talk to him about the things of the Lord. Because I says, I know Nick's excited about talking about Bible stuff. And you know what? Nick knows a lot. He studies. Let him disciple you while you're working on heads, while you're working on these engines. You know what I'm doing there? I'm telling him to learn wherever he can. That's what Naomi is doing to Ruth here. She's saying, let him teach you what you should do next. She understands that Boaz understands the Word of God, especially in this area. And he is a near kinsman. By uncovering his feet, what Ruth is doing, Ruth is asking Boaz to marry her. He's asking Boaz to raise up seed for the household of her deceased husband. And if Boaz refuses, she has the right to remove his sandal and spit in his face. By exposing his feet, she is essentially saying, will you marry me to raise up a family name for my deceased husband? Let me say that again. By uncovering his feet, she is essentially saying, will you raise up a family for my deceased husband? That's the question she's asking. Not just, will you fall in love with me and be my husband? She's asking, will you raise up a family? Will you follow God's plan? Now, by the way, that's God's plan for the Old Testament. We are no longer under the Old Testament. The cross has come. So, we don't have to marry our brother's widow. Besides that, it's not significant now because the land transfer does not occur like it did then, because we're not under the Old Testament law. So you don't have to worry about following this principle today. So if your brother dies and his wife doesn't have a son, you do not have to marry him. That's not what has to happen. Yeah. And besides that, there'd be no reason to do that because the land transfer doesn't work that way anyway. It's all about the land transfer and how God allotted the land and divided it out. It's about the promises of the land for the nation of Israel besides. By the way, it ties in with circumcision. The circumcision was about a promise for the land. All this stuff comes back to the land of Israel, being promised to the people of Israel. And how God wanted to make sure the people of Israel had an allotment. So, to be quite blunt with you, in many ways, this section doesn't sound terribly romantic. But what Ruth is also telling Boaz is that she is willing to do things God's way. I want you to think about this. Ruth is from Moab, a pagan nation, a nation who, to a large extent, has turned their back on God. Not to say that there weren't any believers in Moab, but to a large extent, the people of Moab had turned their back on God, and Ruth hadn't. And she's telling Boaz, I want to do things God's way. You see, Ruth could have married so many other men and had some security, had some rest. She could have done like her sister-in-law Orpah did and stayed back in Moab and married somebody else and had that rest and security. But she wants to follow God's plan and raise up seed for her dead husband. And Boaz is able to recognize that. Look at verses 5 through 9. And she said to her, in other words, Ruth says to Naomi, all that you say I will do. And she went down to the threshing floor and did according to all that her mother-in-law had commanded her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. And she came secretly and uncovered his feet and lie down. And it happened in the middle of the night that the man was startled and bent forward, and behold, a woman was lying at his feet. And he said, who are you? She answered, I am Ruth, your maid. So spread your covering over your maid, for you are a close relative. Notice what she's saying here. She uncovers his feet, and she says, spread your covering. That's spreading that covering of security. It has the idea of a hen covering its chicks with their wings. Make me safe. Make me secure. Spread your covering over me, because you are a near relative. Now, I'm not saying that there wasn't some romance involved. We don't know that. I don't want to make this totally boring. But we don't know for sure that there was romance involved either. The point is, she wanted Boaz because he was a near relative, and it would fulfill the plan of God. She's more interested in fulfilling the plan of God than following some romance. By the way, I don't want to imply that romance and attraction aren't important in a marriage. That's not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying is Ruth and Boaz both recognize the importance of God's plan in all this. That's what this story is about. Is two people that are dedicated to following God's plan and doing what God said to do. And it is a wonderful story. Not just of love. It's not a Hallmark special of love between two people that are pretty. It is a Hallmark story of people who love God and want to obey God. That is what is really precious about this. And then we also see the love for one another. We've already seen that. We saw the servant showing godly love towards Ruth and letting her glean. And then Boaz showing godly love and letting her come under his shade, letting her share the water, giving her protection. You see, sometimes those things are more important than romantic love. Because guess what? When my wife first saw me, she thought I was handsome. A lot of people don't, but my wife did. I might not always be handsome. Okay? But true love and dedication and commitment says whether you look beautiful or you look handsome, you're there to do the right things because you love God and you love others. You know what? I am so glad I got a wife who loves God and loves others. Because even if something happens and she doesn't find me handsome, I know she's there for me. because of her love for God and love for others. And that's what we see with Ruth and Boaz. So this really is a precious romantic story. It is a story that shows that there can be a lasting relationship there. Something even more precious than infatuation. A love that's directed by God. She's making it clear that she is willing to follow the biblical pattern of raising up seed for the deceased. You see, back in Moab, that wouldn't have even been an issue. She would have been just looking for a husband that would fulfill her personal desires, not for a husband to fulfill God's plans. Now, are there any modern day lessons we can learn from this? The one lesson I will give you is make sure you marry a believer. Somebody who has also trusted Christ. Because if you just say, all I'm going to do is marry somebody that I'm attracted to, or marry somebody that has money, you're not doing things God's way. Yes, we're no longer under the Old Testament law, but we still have principles of the New Testament that we can apply for what is right and wrong when it comes to a marriage. And the right and wrong for us is to make sure we're marrying a believer. And Boaz and Ruth are both willing to follow God's plan in their setting. By the way, when Christians marry today, most of them do marry people that they have some attraction to. I think that's good, fine, and proper. And I don't want to imply that there was no attraction between Ruth and Boaz. I don't know that one way or another. The Scripture doesn't say that. What I do know is they are following God's plan for the kinsman redeemer. And Boaz's response shows that he admires Ruth for that. He sees something beautiful in Ruth. And it isn't necessarily just her outward appearance. Verses 10 and 11, chapter 3. Then he said, "May you be blessed of the Lord, my daughter. You have shown your last kindness to be better than the first, by not going after young men, neither poor or rich." I want to pause and explain what he's talking about. Your last kindness more than your first. What was her first kindness and what was her last kindness? I believe her first kindness is, if you go back to chapter 1, verse 8, it talks about Naomi saying, "You were kind to my sons." In other words, Ruth was kind to her first husband who ended up passing away. She was good to him. She was a good wife. She was kind to him. So that was her first kindness. Her last kindness, her last act of kindness towards her deceased husband is marrying a near relative so she can raise up a seed for her deceased husband. She was kind to him when he was alive, and now she's kind to him when he's dead. Because this child that she has will essentially have the legal rights of her deceased husband. And what a kindness that is. And Boaz looks at that and says, yes, you are being kind to your deceased husband. He recognizes that. He recognizes her goodness. And he admires it. You could almost see his heart pattern and say, this is a God-fearing woman. It says, by not going after young men, neither rich nor poor. Boaz is saying, you could have went after so many other guys, and you didn't. You went after one that could fulfill God's plan. You did what was right. Verse 11, he says, "And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you whatever you ask. For all my people in the city know that you are a woman of excellence." You're a woman of excellence. You're a woman that does the right thing. They had heard from Naomi that Ruth was doing the right thing. He had seen her hard work as she's out there reaping in the fields. He knows she's a good catch. Not because of how she looks, but because of what she does. Notice that he said this kindness was fulfilled. That was her last step of kindness to her husband. Boaz then explains some important details if they are going to obey God. In other words, he's teaching her more about the Old Testament law. He's picking up and discipling her further. Verses 12 and 13. He says, and now it is true, I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. Remain this night, and when morning comes, if he will redeem you, good, let him redeem you. But if he does not wish to redeem you, then I will redeem you. As the Lord lives, lie down until morning. Notice what Boaz is doing here. He is making it clear what is most important is that God's standards are applied. God's standards is that she marries a near relative so that her son can have the name of her deceased husband preserved. Boaz recognizes that that is a priority that God had in his law. And Boaz wants to see that happen. Whether he does it or somebody else does it, he wants to see God's will fulfilled. That's the kind of man Boaz is. That's the kind of people we ought to be. We want to see God's will fulfilled. Whether we do it or somebody else does it. By the way, we've been talking about discipling people to come to Christ. Whether you're the one that leads them to Christ or somebody else does, you want to see the gospel presented. You want to see God's will go forward. That's why we shouldn't feel like we're in competition with other Christians. If they're going to do it, great. But if they won't do it, we're going to do it. That's the attitude we ought to have about serving God and serving God alongside others. That's the attitude Boaz has. Yes, I'll do it. If the other guy doesn't do it, but if he does it, great. Because God's will is going forward. But for Boaz to be a redeemer, another man must remove his sandal. Verses 14 through 17. So she lay at his feet until morning, and rose before one could recognize another, and said, let it not be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. Again he said, give me the cloak that is on you, and hold it. So she held it, and he measured 6 measures of barley, and laid it on her. And she went into the city. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did it go, my daughter? And she told her all that the man had done for her. And came to her mother-in-law, and when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did it go, my daughter? And she told her all that the man had done for her. And she said, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me. For he said, do not go to your mother-in-law empty-handed. I want you to notice something here. Boaz doesn't even know if he's going to be the kinsman redeemer. But he's so excited about Ruth wanting to do the right thing that he gives her this huge gift. He might get to be the husband. And he might not get to be the husband. It's not about what he gets. It's about him being excited that Ruth wants to serve the Lord and do what's right. Shouldn't we all be excited when people want to serve the Lord and do right? Whether we get something out of it or not. Regardless, Boaz is going to miss something. He's going to miss a chunk of inheritance that's going to end up being divided between this new offspring of Ruth instead of going and him getting a larger chunk. But when people are doing right, we ought to be excited, regardless if it benefits us or not. I am so excited about this passage because we see people doing that and we see people joyful about that. Joyful when God's word goes forward and God's will is done, regardless of the personal benefit to oneself. As I mentioned earlier, we are not saved by works, we're saved by grace, but we ought to be excited to do what's right. And we ought to be excited when others do what's right. And Boaz is so excited that he just gives her all kinds of extra grain. Naomi understands that there's a proper process for all of this, but she also understands that Boaz is very interested in seeing this whole process through. He had told Ruth in verse 12 that he would find out the next morning. He's not going to delay it. Now, there might be an aspect that he is excited about marrying Ruth, but there's more so the aspect that he is excited about her doing right and knowing that the family of Elimelech is going to have a name. Understand that that family is his family. He's part of that family. He's a near kinsman. We're not told the exact relationship here. I'm not sure if Ruth's husband who passed away was one of his nephews or what it was. But if it was one of his nephews, imagine how excited he is to say, my nephew hasn't been forgotten, because he's probably grieving the loss too, because that was his relative. And he sees how precious and important this is, that his relative is not being forgotten. He's not thinking about his own personal state. In fact, we talked about this a little bit Monday night. We were going through the book of Ecclesiastes. It's better to go to the house of mourning than the house of feasting. It's better to go to the funeral because that's what people need. Even though it isn't the most pleasant thing to go to the funeral, it's better to go there because that's what other people need. It's not for the living or for the dead, it's for the living. There are times we make sacrifices because it's a good thing to do because we care about others. And that's what Boaz is doing here. Verse 18, then she said, wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest until he has settled it today. You see, the story of Ruth and Boaz isn't just a story of romance. It is a story of the love for God and a love for others. It is a story of people wanting to do right and wanting to do what God said to do. It is a story that should inspire all of us as we walk through life to say we want to do what God says to do because we know it's best. And we ought to have joy in doing God's will and in seeing other people do God's will. I'm going to give you a moment to reflect in prayer. During that time, I want you to pray for opportunities to do God's will in your life, so that you can be salt and light in a world that sees so many people walking away from doing God's will. And then I want you to pray that as people see you doing God's will, that you have opportunities to tell them why, and that those opportunities lead to a chance to share the gospel, and that you do not pass up that chance, but that you boldly proclaim Christ, His love for you and His love for them. Give you just a moment. Reflect in prayer. Talk to God about that. After you've had a few moments to reflect in prayer, I appreciate having Chris here. Chris, would you close us with prayer?